Hello, 1301. This is my lecture on the writers that Tompkins mentions in her essay. I never really trick my face-to-face classes, but with Tompkins, usually in an essay, I walk in the class and start asking questions. I start lecturing. But with Tompkins, on the first day, I break the class into groups and assign them some of Tompkins's writers. And it's a little bit like what I said in my lecture about Walker Percy. They get scared. Oh my God, this is a test. The teacher's going to ask me questions. I'm going to look stupid. I don't know what's going on. And they start Googling and they're really nervous. And then the first group comes up and starts talking about Miller and Vaughan. And about 30 seconds after they finish and I start asking questions, they start understanding my point and Tompkins's point. The height of Native American culture is debatable. Native American culture in America, but I might just randomly pick 1750. So now it's 2020, it's 250 years later, but people are still writing books about the Native Americans, what they did, their culture. So books have been written maybe by rich white people, rich white men for 300 years, but seemingly we still haven't gotten to the truth. So you might want to think about some of these writers. If someone wrote their book in the 50s, you might think about your grandparents, your great-grandparents, what American history says about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. If you want some examples, the first writer she mentions is Miller. He wrote his text in 1956. He described America as a vacant wilderness, and he compares colonial America to colonial Africa. That's a little bit racist. And he calls the Native Americans wild savages. So again, that's 1956. I would ask my face-to-face students, what were people like in 1956? Who was doing the writing and why? And it was generally rich white men. And then I might ask them, do they think Miller's a bad guy, or is he just a product of 1956? And you should do that for all these writers. I should mention that the first 6 or so are third-person accounts, people who are writing about Native American history 200 years after these events happened. The next writer was Vaughan in 1965. His version was a little bit softer. He celebrates Christians and Puritans and how they brought God to an inferior culture. So again, Miller, 1955, Native Americans are savages. We have to take over. 1965, the writer Vaughan says the Native Americans didn't understand about God and religion. We need to bring God to them. The next writer is Jennings, 1975. He's critical of the Puritans. He says the Puritans, the white people, raped, murdered, pillaged the Native American culture, took the land, took the money, whatever. So you could maybe say that was the impact of 1960s culture on Jennings when he wrote in 1975. So again, don't forget the events they're writing about is 1750, but you know, the version of the truth of Native American culture, of history, changes from 56 to 65 to 75. And one of the questions Tompkins asks is why. Then she talks about Martin, impact of the 1980s ideology. He argues that Native American culture failed because they didn't understand the fur trade and Western economic thought. So maybe if you think about the 80s, it was about capitalism making money. So the Native Americans were about the land, about the animals, like worshiping the wolf, and they should have been thinking about, making money. So that's why Martin in the 80s said Native American culture went under. The next two writers are Kretsch and Hudson, and they basically disagree with Martin's theories about the fur trade and capitalism. I hear a police siren, so I'm in Odessa. So yeah, Kretsch and Hudson aren't maybe not trying to help Native American culture as much as they're taking issue with what Martin wrote. So they're kind of starting a feud, but that's their rationale for writing about the Native Americans. And then the last third-person account in this section is Axtell from the 70s or maybe late 60s. He says it's a privilege to be captured. Wouldn't it be wonderful to hunt and live in a teepee and smoke the peace pipe? So Axtell is writing his version of the Native Americans, maybe a rich white guy, but he's fantasizing about being a Native American back in the day. So what's his motivation? Then she switches to first-person accounts. Books that were written during the time the Native Americans were in full effect, 1700s, 1800s. And you would think that if you're writing your book when all this is happening, your version would be closer to the truth. The first writer she mentioned is Heard. I wrote sensationalized TMZ version. Native Americans kidnap children, the brutalities inflicted on a captured white girl. So Sex and Violence sells books. You're writing this in 1750. If you write your story like what happens to the little white girls who gets kidnapped, a lot more people buy your book and you make a lot more money. So maybe you have to take Heard's version with a grain of salt, even though he was writing during that time. Rowlandson, 1680, Boston. It's a Christian perspective. God will punish the sinners, but also Rowlandson doesn't like people who smoke tobacco. So there's large chunks of his book on Native American history that's about God's going to punish the smokers. So Rowlandson is thinking about smoking more, or the evils of smoking, more so than Native American history. Wood, 1634, English perspective. My quote says, Indians are friendly and courteous. Tompkins says that Wood was a travel agent in England. He wanted people to buy boats and supplies and sail to America. So he's a travel agent. He's making money if people go to America, to the new land to start their life. So he's not really talking about the Native Americans, or his point is really to make money for himself. Whitaker, 1623, was an English minister. Indians are wild and naked sinners. He's trying to get missionaries to go to America, but he makes money on that. If he's a religious leader, he gets more fame and popularity if he's a missionary who's going to save the Native Americans. So maybe his motives aren't pure either. Then the last three writers are contemporaries of Tompkins. Burkhofer criticizes writers like Wood and Whitaker. White writers stereotype the Native Americans for their own personal gains. So this guy, a contemporary 2000 writer, looking at all these other writers saying they want to sell their books, they're stereotyping Native Americans per when they were writing. That's not the real history. And I'd have to know more about Rowlandson and Wood to understand the whys, but a modern writer writes his book saying older writers are stereotyping, they're kind of being racist in their portrayal of the Native Americans. Kupperman, 1980, talks about the impact of class and wealth on social norms. So to some degree, when he's looking at older writers from 300 years ago, it breaks down along wealth and status. So his point about Native Americans isn't really about the Native Americans as much as it is the rich writers who are writing about them. So he's studying the history of the history. So it's really about the rich and poor of the white people who are writing 300 years ago. And then Tompkins at the end, her conclusion is fairly pessimistic. There's no real solution to the problem of history. And she sets it up. She goes to the library, gets 20 books, and there's 20 different versions of what happened to the Native Americans. And she's somewhere in the mix pretending maybe she's a student writing a term paper. What's the student do when your term paper's due the next day and you have 20 different versions of the truth? 1950s version says Native Americans are wild savages. 1960s version says they need God. 1970s version, wouldn't it be cool to smoke the peace pipe and live in a teepee? 1980s version is about money and the fur trade. She goes back to 300 years ago, and one writer wants to make money because he's a travel agent. Another writer wants to be a famous missionary. Another writer wants sinners to be punished, people who smoke tobacco to be punished. So I don't think you could disagree with me, but I don't think she really offers any solutions at the end. Her study is pessimistic. What do writers do if they're digging in for the truth of Native American culture? What's a student do when she's writing a paper and there's not necessarily a truth? We can debate this later, but maybe we go with the most modern version. Maybe we go with the most reputable sources. So something written, a book from the University of Texas, is probably more reputable than a website you would find. And then maybe when you're writing your paper on Native American history or African American history or Hispanic American history, you pick sources that matter to you the most, that line up with what you think. But, that takes more time and effort too. You can't do that at midnight. You have to do a lot more research. And that's kind of the problem of history. Okay.